Marcus Reeves had been staring at the same patch of cracked desert earth for 14 straight hours, his weathered hands gripping a rusted shovel handle so tightly his knuckles had gone white. 14 hours since he discovered what the Bobcat pack had been guarding beneath his worthless $300 ranch. 14 hours since his entire understanding of the cursed land he'd bought in desperation had been turned upside down. And 14 hours since he realized that sometimes the most broken places hold the most extraordinary secrets. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly around the abandoned ranch, a wasteland of thorny mesquite and sun-bleached stone that most people wouldn't pay $300 to burn down, let alone call it home. But Marcus wasn't most people. 3 months ago, when the bank had foreclosed on his tiny apartment in Phoenix and his disability checks barely covered food, let alone rent, he'd seen the online auction listing for this forgotten piece of nothing and bid every last dollar he had. The seller's warning about the property being cursed had only made him laugh bitterly. What curse could be worse than coming home from Afghanistan with shattered legs, shattered dreams, and a purple heart that couldn't pay for groceries? The locals in nearby Dust Creek had shaken their heads when word spread about the crazy veteran who'd bought the old Santana place. "That land's been trouble for 40 years, they'd whispered. "Animals act strange out there. Sounds at night that ain't natural. And those bobcats, they don't just pass through like normal wildlife. They stay, they watch, they guard something nobody's ever been fool enough to find out what." Marcus had dismissed it all as small-town superstition until his first night on the property, when he'd counted no fewer than 8 pairs of glowing golden eyes surrounding his beat-up trailer, watching him with an intelligence that made his combat-trained instincts scream danger. But instead of attacking or running, they've simply sat vigil, as if waiting for something, or someone. Now, after 3 months of the strangest coexistence he'd ever experienced, Marcus finally understood what they'd been protecting, and it was about to change everything. Marcus Reeves hadn't always been a man with nothing left to lose. 5 years ago, he'd been Staff Sergeant Marcus Reeves, leading a convoy through the mountains outside Kandahar, when the IED buried beneath the dirt road had changed everything in a split second of fire and twisted metal. The blast had shattered both of his legs and killed 2 of his best friends, but the real damage went deeper than bone and flesh. It had shattered his sense of purpose, his belief that he could protect the people who mattered most. The Army had patched him up as best they could, sent him home with medals and commendations, and a monthly disability check that seemed generous until you tried to live on it in a world where rent cost more than he'd ever imagined possible. His wife Sarah had tried to make it work for 2 years, but watching him struggle through physical therapy sessions he couldn't afford, job interviews that went nowhere because employers saw his limp before they saw his qualifications, and sleepless nights filled with nightmares about friends he couldn't save had slowly worn away her patience and hope. When she finally left, taking her daughter Emma with her, Marcus understood. He was a broken man living in a broken trailer, surviving on memories of who he used to be. The foreclosure notice had almost been a relief. At least it forced him to make a decision instead of just existing in limbo. He'd sold everything he owned except for his old Ford pickup, his service rifle, and a photograph of Emma on her 6th birthday, grinning gap-toothed as she held up a drawing she'd made of her daddy in his uniform. The ranch had called to him, not because it was beautiful or promising, but because it was as forgotten and abandoned as he felt. $300 for 40 acres of desert that nobody wanted, nobody visited, and nobody cared about. It seemed like the perfect place for a man who'd stopped believing he deserved better. He'd planned to live quietly, bother no one, and maybe find some peace in the vast emptiness. He never expected the land to have its own plans for him. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when Marcus stepped outside his trailer to find a circle of 7 bobcats sitting motionless around a specific patch of cracked desert earth near the old well. Not hunting, not moving, just watching that same 10-foot square of cracked earth with the intensity of soldiers standing guard.
When approached, they hadn't scattered like normal wild animals. Instead, they'd turned those unsettling golden eyes on him with what could only be described as expectation. Marcus had lived with enough danger to trust his instincts, and every instinct screamed that he was looking at something significant. The Bobcats had maintained their vigil for 3 days straight, taking turns but never leaving the area completely unguarded. They didn't eat the rabbits that wandered too close to their circle. They didn't hunt at night. They simply watched and waited, as if protecting something precious buried beneath the sun-baked clay. On the 4th morning, curiosity finally overcame caution. Marcus had grabbed his service shovel from the trailer and approached the circle of watchers. To his amazement, they'd parted like a living curtain, creating a clear path to the center of their formation, but never taking their eyes off him. The message was unmistakable. They were giving him permission, but they were also watching to see what he would do with it. The first few inches had yielded nothing but hard-packed dirt and scattered pebbles. But at 18 inches down, his shovel had struck something that definitely wasn't rock, something smooth and artificial that had no business being buried in the middle of nowhere. As he'd carefully excavated around it, his hands had begun to shake, not from fear this time, but from recognition. It was a metal container, military grade, with markings he remembered from his deployment. The kind of container used for transporting classified materials or high-value items that needed to stay hidden. The kind of container that suggested someone had buried something out here that they'd never intended anyone to find. As Marcus had lifted it free from the earth, he'd realized he was holding either the answer to why this land was considered cursed or the beginning of the most important mission of his life. The container held documents that changed everything Marcus thought he knew about his worthless desert ranch. Maps marked with coordinates, letters written in Spanish and English, and photographs that made his blood run cold. Not military classified materials, but something far more personal and devastating, evidence of a human trafficking route that had been operating through this exact piece of land for over a decade. The photographs showed families, mothers clutching children, fathers carrying everything they owned in worn backpacks, being led across the desert by smugglers who promised safe passage to a better life. But the maps told a different story. Red X marks indicated locations where groups had been abandoned, left to die of thirst and exposure when they couldn't keep up or pay additional fees. The most recent photos were dated just 6 months ago. Marcus spread the documents across his trailer's small table, his hands trembling as he pieced together the horrific truth. The well the Bobcats had been guarding wasn't just an old water source. According to the maps, it marked a cache point where desperate families had been told to wait for pickup that never came. The curse the locals whispered about wasn't supernatural at all. It was the echo of dozens of souls who had died on this land, abandoned by criminals who saw human desperation as profit. The final document in the container was a letter addressed to no one, written by someone who signed it only as Miguel. It detailed locations of mass graves, described how the operation worked, and included names of border officials who'd been bribed to look the other way. At the bottom, in desperate handwriting, were GPS coordinates for 13 different sites across the desert where evidence had been buried. As Marcus read those coordinates, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before the explosion in Afghanistan, a sense of purpose burning through his chest like wildfire. These weren't just numbers on a page. They were the final testimony of someone who'd tried to expose a network of killers. Someone who hid this evidence, knowing he might not survive to deliver it himself. The Bobcats had been guarding more than buried secrets. They'd been waiting for someone who would act on what they found. Marcus established a new routine that would have seemed insane to anyone watching from the outside. Every morning at dawn, he loaded his truck with water, his military entrenching tool, and the growing collection of evidence he was gathering from the desert floor. The Bobcats had appointed themselves as his guides, leading him to locations that weren't on Miguel's maps, but clearly held significance they wanted him to discover. The first 3 sites yielded heartbreaking proof of the trafficking operation's scope: scattered clothing, children's toys weathered by years of desert wind, and identification documents that
Told stories of families who'd traveled thousands of miles, chasing the American dream, only to find death in the Arizona wasteland. Marcus photographed everything, logged GPS coordinates with military precision, and carefully collected items that could serve as evidence when he was ready to contact authorities. But it was at the 4th site that he discovered he wasn't working alone. Hidden beneath the cairn of stones that the lead bobcat had pawed at insistently, Marcus found fresh water bottles, energy bars, and a handwritten note in Spanish that roughly translated to, "For those still searching." Someone else was out here, someone who knew about the graves and was leaving supplies for families still looking for missing relatives. The routine became sacred. Dawn patrol with his bobcat escorts, systematic excavation and documentation, careful preservation of evidence in waterproof containers buried at his ranch. The physical work was punishing on his damaged legs, but the pain felt different now. Not the meaningless ache of a broken body, but the purposeful burn of muscles working towards something important. Week after week, the collection grew. Photographs of personal effects, detailed maps marking confirmed grave sites, testimonials he'd found hidden in bottles and containers left by other witnesses. The bobcats seemed to approve of his methodical approach, often sitting in formation around him as he worked, their vigilant presence both protection and encouragement. As October turned to November, Marcus realized he was building something much larger than a collection of evidence. He was assembling a comprehensive case that could expose an entire criminal network. But more importantly, he was creating a memorial to the forgotten dead, ensuring their stories would finally be heard. Word of the strange veteran and his bobcat companions had begun spreading through Dust Creek in whispers that carried more curiosity than fear. Rosa Martinez, who ran the only gas station for 50 miles, noticed that Marcus had started coming in twice a week instead of once a month, buying supplies that didn't match his usual pattern of survival basics: bottled water by the case, heavy-duty garbage bags, disposable cameras, and topographic maps of areas no tourist had any business visiting. When Father Antonio Vasquez received an anonymous envelope containing photographs of rosaries, children's shoes, and identification cards scattered across desert locations he recognized from his own family's crossing stories, he knew something significant was happening. The accompanying note, written in careful English, simply said, "These people deserve to be remembered," along with GPS coordinates and a request to pray for them. Rosa's nephew Carlos, home on leave from his deployment in Germany, had driven out to the ranch after hearing the stories about the veteran who'd bought cursed land. What he found wasn't a crazy hermit, but a fellow soldier, methodically documenting what looked like the largest crime scene he'd ever encountered. The precision of Marcus's work, the careful cataloging of evidence, and the respectful way he handled personal items told Carlos this wasn't amateur investigation, but professional-level forensic work. By December, a quiet network had formed without any formal organization or announcement. Father Vasquez began receiving regular envelopes containing photographs and location data that he forwarded to immigrant advocacy groups across the Southwest. Carlos started bringing military friends who helped with the more physically demanding excavation work. Rosa became the unofficial supply depot, accepting cash donations from community members who wanted to help but didn't know how. The trafficking network that had operated in shadow for years suddenly faced something they'd never planned for: a determined veteran with nothing left to lose, backed by wild allies who knew every secret the desert held, and supported by a growing group of people who refused to let the forgotten stay buried. But as word spread beyond Dust Creek, it reached ears that had too much to lose if Marcus continued his work. The black SUVs arrived at Marcus's ranch on a moonless Thursday night in January, their engines cutting through the desert silence like knives. 3 vehicles, no license plates visible,
filled with men who moved with the practiced coordination of professionals. They'd found out about the veteran who'd been digging up their buried secrets, and they'd come to make sure he stopped permanently. Marcus woke to the low, threatening growls of 8 bobcats surrounding his trailer in a defensive formation he'd never seen before. Their usual calm surveillance had transformed into something fierce and primal, every muscle coiled for attack. Through his window, he could see muzzle flashes and hear the distinctive crack of suppressed rifles as the intruders tried to eliminate his wild protectors first. The attack had been planned as a simple assassination disguised as an accident. A lone veteran, living isolated on cursed land, found dead from an apparent fall or equipment malfunction. No witnesses, no investigation, no disruption to a trafficking operation worth millions of dollars annually. But whoever had planned this hit hadn't accounted for the bobcats, and they certainly hadn't expected their target to be a decorated combat veteran with survival skills honed in Afghanistan's deadliest valleys. Marcus grabbed his service rifle and the waterproof case containing the most damaging evidence, then slipped out the trailer's back exit while the gunmen were still dealing with his feline guardians. The bobcats had bought him precious minutes, but he could hear radio chatter indicating more vehicles were en route. The entire operation was being burned down, which meant they knew exactly how much he'd uncovered. Racing across terrain he now knew better than any place he'd ever lived, Marcus reached the emergency cache he'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Satellite phone, backup evidence files, and detailed instructions he'd written for Rosa, Carlos, and Father Vasquez about how to contact federal authorities if anything happened to him. The criminals had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a broken man living on worthless land. Instead, they'd declared war on a soldier who'd finally found something worth fighting for, backed by the desert's most cunning predators and a community that wouldn't let him face this alone. The satellite phone connected on the second ring, patching Marcus directly through to the FBI's Phoenix field office while bullets whined overhead, and his Bobcat allies harassed the attackers with guerrilla tactics that would have made his old unit proud. Special Agent Linda Vega had been waiting for this call ever since the anonymous evidence packages had started arriving through church networks 3 weeks earlier, building a federal case that was already in motion. This is Reeves, coordinates 32.7 north, 113.2 west. I've got multiple hostiles on site attempting to destroy evidence of Operation Desert Grave, Marcus transmitted with the crisp professionalism of a soldier calling in air support. He'd learned those radio protocols in mountains half a world away, never imagining they'd save his life in his own backyard. The months of systematic documentation suddenly became his greatest tactical advantage. Every cache location, every piece of evidence, every contact in his network had been GPS logged and photographed with redundant backups stored in locations the attackers couldn't possibly know about. While they'd come to eliminate one man and his discoveries, they were actually trying to stop an investigation that had already spread across 3 states and involved dozens of witnesses. From his concealed position behind the ancient well, Marcus watched the Bobcats execute coordinated attacks that disrupted the gunmen's night vision equipment and communication lines. These desert predators had been protecting this land longer than anyone realized, and they fought with an intelligence that transformed random wildlife into the most effective combat support he'd ever experienced. The sound of helicopters approaching from the southeast told Marcus that Agent Vega had taken his call seriously. Federal backup was 12 minutes out, which meant he only had to survive that long. His damaged legs screamed in protest as he moved between cover positions, but the pain felt like victory now instead of limitation. Every step was powered by the knowledge that he was no longer fighting just to survive, but fighting to ensure that 43 confirmed victims finally received justice. The traffickers had chosen their target poorly. They had expected to eliminate a broken veteran, but instead they'd wakened a warrior who'd spent months preparing for exactly this battle. The FBI raid that followed became the largest human trafficking bust in Arizona history. 47 arrests, 13 confirmed mass grave sites, and evidence that dismantled a network spanning from Mexico to Canada. But the real victory wasn't measured in prosecutions. or recovered remains, it was measured in the families who finally learned what happened to their missing loved ones, and in the memorial garden that now stands where Marcus first found Miguel's buried testimony. Agent Vega later told reporters that the investigation's success came from an unprecedented collaboration between a decorated veteran, local community members, and what she diplomatically called unusual environmental factors. She never mentioned the bobcats by name, but the federal report included a recommendation that the ranch be designated as a protected wildlife sanctuary, ensuring the guardians of the desert would never be disturbed. Marcus still lives on his $300 ranch, but it's no longer worthless land forgotten by the world. Immigration advocates make pilgrimages to the memorial sites he maintains. Military veterans struggling with purpose seek him out for guidance, and every morning at dawn, 8 bobcats still conduct their patrol, no longer guarding buried secrets, but protecting something far more valuable. Proof that even the most broken places can become sacred ground when someone refuses to let the forgotten stay buried. The cursed land had found its true owner, and the broken veteran had found his most important mission. Sometimes the desert reveals its secrets not to those who seek treasure, but to those who understand that some things are worth protecting at any cost. If stories like this inspire you to believe that extraordinary purpose can emerge from ordinary desperation, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who know that heroes come in the most unexpected forms. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that prove courage and compassion can change the world.